Professor David Miller felt his stomach drop as the transport shuttle's engine powered down with a final whir. Through the small porthole window, he could see the massive structure of Kepler Station stretching out like a metallic city floating in space. The gleaming corridors seemed to go on forever, with strange lights pulsing along the walls in patterns he didn't recognize. He grabbed his old leather briefcase, the same one he'd carried through 20 years of teaching physics at Cambridge. The worn corners and scuffed surface felt familiar and comforting in his sweaty palms. Taking a deep breath, David stepped through the airlock and into the most advanced research facility in the known galaxy. The first thing that hit him was the noise. Not loud exactly, but completely alien. There were clicking sounds, like someone tapping metal with their fingernails, mixed with what sounded like wind chimes and a gentle breeze. The air itself seemed to hum with an energy that made the hair on his arms stand up. David had studied the files Dr. Rebecca Thompson from Oxford had given him, but nothing could have prepared him for actually seeing the aliens up close. A group of Lumians floated past him, and he had to stop and stare. They looked like living glass sculptures, their bodies shifting between solid and see-through in a way that hurt his eyes if he watched too long. One of them turned toward him, and David realized it was studying him just as intently. Further down the corridor, he spotted the Chitauri. They moved like giant ants, but walked upright on two legs. Their movements were so precise and mechanical that David wondered if they were actually robots until he saw one pause to scratch what looked like an itch behind its antenna. A small floating device zipped up to him, projecting a holographic map in front of his face. The symbols were completely foreign, but somehow his translation earpiece made sense of the glowing directions. He was supposed to report to the main administration hub, wherever that was. As David walked deeper into the station, he passed laboratories with equipment he couldn't even begin to understand. Through one transparent wall, he saw what looked like miniature stars floating in glass containers. In another room, geometric shapes were rearranging themselves in midair without anyone touching them. He felt completely out of his depth. Back on Earth, he was respected in his field. Students looked up to him. Colleagues sought his opinions on quantum mechanics and theoretical physics. He felt like a caveman who had wandered into a rocket ship. The weight of responsibility pressed down on his shoulders like a heavy blanket. He wasn't just David Miller anymore. He was a representative of all humanity to the most brilliant minds in the galaxy. What if he said something stupid? What if his simple Earth physics seemed primitive and embarrassing compared to what these aliens already knew? His footsteps echoed strangely in the corridor, and he noticed that other beings stopped their conversations to watch him pass. Some seemed curious, tilting their heads or extending what might have been sensory organs in his direction. Others appeared almost nervous, moving quickly to the far side of the hallway as if they weren't sure what he might do. The melodic voice that interrupted his worried thoughts was unlike anything he'd ever heard. It was like listening to a song, with notes that seemed to flow together in perfect harmony. David looked up to see a Lumian approaching, its translucent body shimmering with soft colors that reminded him of soap bubbles. "Professor Miller," the being asked, and David was amazed at how the translation device made it sound almost human while keeping that musical quality. "I am Research Coordinator Veltar. We have been expecting you." David straightened his shoulders and tried to project more confidence than he felt. "Yes, that's me. Thank you for having me here. We have prepared your quarters according to the specifications provided by your government," Veltar continued, gliding alongside David as they walked. "Your first lecture has been scheduled for tomorrow morning. The students are quite excited to learn about human approaches to physics." That last comment made David's heart skip a beat. Human approaches to physics? What did that even mean? Physics was physics, wasn't it? The same laws applied everywhere in the universe. But looking around at the impossible technology surrounding him, David began to wonder if maybe humans had been thinking about things all wrong. "I'm looking forward to it," he managed to say, though his voice sounded shakier than he'd intended. "I hope I can share some interesting concepts with them." Veltar's form brightened slightly, which David hoped was a good sign. "I am certain you will find our academic environment most stimulating, Professor Miller. Your species has a reputation for creative problem-solving that precedes you." As they continued walking through the station's gleaming corridors, David clutched his briefcase a little tighter and wondered what exactly he had gotten himself into. David barely slept that night. He kept staring at the ceiling of his assigned quarters, going over his lecture notes for the 100th time. The room was comfortable enough, though everything felt slightly off. The bed was too firm, the lights had a bluish tint that never quite felt natural, and the air recycling system made a soft whooshing sound that reminded him constantly that he was floating in space, far from home. When morning came, he put on his best suit and grabbed his briefcase. Walking through the station's corridors toward the lecture hall, David noticed even more alien species than he'd seen the day before. There were beings that looked like walking crystals, others that seemed to be made of shifting liquid metal, and some that defied description entirely. The lecture hall was unlike anything at Cambridge. It was a massive circular chamber with seats arranged in ascending rings around a central platform. The architecture seemed to bend and flow in impossible ways, and David suspected the room itself was alive somehow. Strange bioluminescent patterns pulsed gently along the walls, creating an atmosphere that was both beautiful and unsettling. Students began filing in, and David's nervousness spiked. These weren't just any students. These were graduate-level researchers from civilizations that had been traveling between stars for thousands of years. What could he possibly teach them that they didn't already know? The variety of beings taking their seats was staggering. The Lumians floated rather than sat, their translucent forms hovering above their designated spots. The Chitauri arranged themselves with mechanical precision, their compound eyes all seeming to focus on him at once. There were other species he hadn't encountered yet, including what looked like walking trees with crystalline bark and creatures that appeared to be living shadows with glowing eyes. David walked to the central platform, where the station's maintenance crew had delivered his requested equipment. Looking at it now, surrounded by all this advanced alien technology, his demonstration materials seemed almost embarrassingly primitive. A few simple pulleys, some basic levers, several metal weights of different sizes, and the steel beam he'd specifically asked for. The steel beam was about 6 feet long, and roughly the size of a railroad tie. Back on Earth, it would be considered a standard construction material, nothing special. Here, lying on the polished platform under the chamber's alien lighting, it looked like some kind of ancient artifact. David cleared his throat and activated his translation device. "Good morning, everyone," he began, his voice carrying clearly throughout the chamber thanks to the room's acoustic design. "I'm honored to be here today to share some insights into human physics applications." He gestured toward his simple equipment spread across the platform. "Today, we'll explore mechanical advantage and how humans have used these basic principles for thousands of years to build our civilization." The silence in the room was complete. Every eye, compound eye, optical sensor, and whatever the other beings used for vision was focused entirely on him. David could feel their attention like a physical weight. "These concepts," he continued, warming up slightly, "might seem basic to species with your advanced technology, but they represent the foundation of everything humans have ever built. Our pyramids, our skyscrapers, our bridges, even our spacecraft." A Chitauri student in the third row raised one of its segmented arms. The gesture was so precise it looked choreographed. "Professor Miller," it said through the translation system, its voice sounding like clicking metal, "how do humans typically manipulate such dense materials without technological assistance?" David paused, not quite understanding what the student meant. Without technological assistance? He looked at his pulleys and levers. "Well, these are technological assistants, in a way, but you're right that they are quite simple compared to what I've seen here on the station." He walked over to the steel beam, running his hand along its surface. The metal was cool and solid under his fingers. Sometimes, though, the most effective tool is the human body itself. We've evolved to be quite capable of physical manipulation of our environment. Several students exchanged what David assumed were glances, though it was hard to tell with some of the species. He noticed a ripple of movement through the Lumians, their forms flickering more rapidly than usual. "Let me show you what I mean," David said, positioning himself next to the steel beam. "This is a basic piece of construction material that any human construction worker will be familiar with. Let's start with a simple demonstration of human lifting techniques and body mechanics." He bent down next to the beam, testing his grip. The metal was rough under his hands, with a texture that would provide good purchase. David had lifted similar materials countless times during his younger days when he'd worked construction jobs to pay for university. "The key," he explained to his alien audience, is understanding leverage, weight distribution, and proper body mechanics. Humans have been moving heavy objects like this for thousands of years, long before we developed more sophisticated machinery. What David didn't realize was that his casual reference to moving heavy objects had caused a stir among his students. Several of the Chitauri were making rapid clicking sounds to each other. The Lumians were pulsing with what might have been excitement or alarm. Even the shadowy being seemed to lean forward with interest. David straightened up and looked out at his audience. Any questions before we begin the practical demonstration? The silence that followed was so complete that David could hear the soft humming of the station's life support systems. Every being in that lecture hall was staring at him with an intensity that made him wonder if he'd already made some terrible mistake. David walked over to the steel beam with the same confidence he'd had when moving furniture in his apartment or helping friends load trucks back home. He'd done this kind of thing thousands of times before. To him, it was as natural as picking up a heavy suitcase or moving a bookshelf. "Now, watch carefully," he said to his alien audience, completely unaware of the tension building in the room. "The most important thing is your stance. You want your feet shoulder-width apart for stability." He positioned himself next to the beam, his worn leather shoes finding good purchase on the platform surface. The steel felt familiar under his hands, rough and solid, exactly like construction materials he'd worked with during his university summers. "Keep your back straight." David continued his explanation, bending at the knees while maintaining eye contact with his students. "You want to lift with your legs, not your back. That's how you avoid injury." He wrapped his fingers around the beam, testing his grip. The metal was cold against his palms, and he could feel the weight of it even before lifting. Maybe 200 pounds, he estimated. Heavy enough to be a good demonstration, but nothing he couldn't handle. "The key is engaging your core muscles," David said, taking a deep breath. "Think of it like creating a natural weight belt with your own body." What happened next took less than 3 seconds, but those 3 seconds changed everything. David straightened his legs smoothly, lifting the massive steel beam from the platform. The metal rose steadily until it reached chest height, where he held it casually with both hands. To him, it felt like lifting a moderately heavy package, perhaps something you'd struggle with after carrying it for a long distance, but nothing extreme. "As you can see," he began, completely focused on his teaching, "by using proper biomechanics, a human can easily manipulate materials that might seem heavy, but with the right technique." The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was a kind of absolute silence that happens when every living being in a room stops breathing at the same time. David looked up from the beam he was holding to see a lecture hall full of what could only be described as shock. The Chitauri students had frozen completely. Their usually constant clicking sounds stopped dead. The Lumians were flickering so rapidly they looked like broken holograms. Even the shadowy beings seemed to have pressed themselves back into their seats. But it was one of the Lumian students in the front row that broke first. The being's translucent form began pulsing with violent, chaotic colors. Its carefully maintained semi-solid shape started collapsing and reforming rapidly, like a soap bubble being hit by a strong wind. Then, with a sound like glass breaking, the Lumian student fell from its hovering position and crashed to the floor, its form scattering into what looked like glowing mist before slowly pulling itself back together. That's when the alarm started. Red lights began flashing throughout the lecture hall, and a piercing siren filled the air. The room's translation system began broadcasting in multiple languages simultaneously, creating a cacophony of urgent warnings that David couldn't understand. "Is everyone all right?" David asked, his voice rising over the alarm noise. He was still holding the steel beam, genuinely concerned as he watched the chaos unfold around him. The Lumian student was struggling to maintain its form on the floor, while other beings throughout the room were showing signs of what looked like panic. Several Chitauri students were backing away from the central platform, their movements no longer precise and mechanical but jerky and erratic. Some were making rapid clicking sounds that the translation system couldn't keep up with, creating a wall of incomprehensible noise. The crystalline beings were resonating with high-pitched tones that hurt David's ears, while the shadowy creatures were actually retreating into the darker corners of the lecture hall as if trying to hide. "Please, everyone calm down," David said, looking around in confusion. "It's just a basic lifting demonstration. There's nothing dangerous about." His words were cut off as the lecture hall's doors burst open, and a swarm of security drones poured into the room. The mechanical devices were sleek and silver, about the size of basketballs, and they moved with purpose toward the central platform where David stood. Behind the drones came security officers from at least 3 different species, all wearing what appeared to be protective gear. They were shouting orders in languages David didn't recognize, their voices adding to the chaos of alarms and panicked student chatter. "Sir, please set down the object and step away from the platform," one of the security officers called out through a translation device. The being looked like a taller version of the Chitauri, but with more armor-like plating covering its body. David looked down at the steel beam in his hands, then back at the chaos surrounding him. The security drones were now forming a circle around the platform, their sensors all pointed directly at him. Students were being evacuated through multiple exits, many of them still showing signs of distress. "I don't understand," David said, his voice almost lost in the noise. "What's wrong?" "It's just a piece of steel." But even as he spoke, David was beginning to realize that something fundamental had gone very wrong with his simple physics demonstration. The look of absolute terror on the faces around him wasn't the reaction of beings witnessing a routine academic exercise. It was a reaction of creatures who had just seen something impossible. Slowly, carefully, David bent his knees and lowered the steel beam back to the platform. The moment the metal touched down, he heard what sounded like a collective sigh of relief from the remaining beings in the room. As he straightened up and raised his hand to show he was no longer holding anything, David couldn't shake the feeling that he had just crossed a line he didn't even know existed. The medical bay on Kepler Station looked more like something from a science fiction movie than any hospital David had ever seen. The walls curved in impossible ways, glowing with a soft blue light that seemed to come from within the material itself. Strange machines hummed quietly in the corners, their purposes completely mysterious to him. David sat on what he assumed was an examination table, though it felt more like sitting on a cloud that somehow managed to support his weight. His hands were still shaking slightly, not from exertion, but from the complete confusion of what had just happened. Around him, beings from at least 4 different species were taking readings with devices he couldn't identify, speaking in hushed tones through their translation units. A Chitauri researcher approached him with something that looked like a metallic spider. The device crawled across David's arm, and he could feel tiny pinpricks as it apparently took samples of something. Another being, one of the crystalline species, held up a device that projected holographic numbers and symbols into the air. The symbols meant nothing to David, but the researcher's posture suggested excitement or concern. "Please try to remain still, Professor Miller," said Dr. Elizabeth Hayes, the station's chief xenobiologist. She was one of the few humans on the station, a tall woman with graying hair who had been studying alien physiology for over a decade. "We're running some comparative analyses that might help explain what happened in your lecture." David nodded, though he still felt like he was missing something fundamental. "Dr. Hayes, I really don't understand what all the fuss is about. It was just a basic strength demonstration. Any construction worker back home could have done the same thing." The room fell silent at his words. Several of the alien researchers exchanged what David was beginning to recognize as meaningful looks. Dr. Hayes glanced at a datapad, then back at David with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Professor Miller," she said carefully, "that statement might be part of the problem." Before David could ask what she meant, the medical bay doors slid open with a soft hiss. Dr. Thomas Webb, the human liaison officer, entered looking like he hadn't slept in days. His usually neat appearance was disheveled, his tie loose and his hair messy. Behind him came 2 security officers and what appeared to be a high-ranking station administrator. "Everyone out," Thomas said firmly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who was used to being obeyed. "I need to speak with Professor Miller privately." The alien researchers began packing up their equipment, though David noticed they seemed reluctant to leave. Dr. Hayes lingered the longest, giving David a look that seemed to say good luck before following the others out of the medical bay. Thomas waited until the doors sealed shut before turning to face David. His expression was a mixture of concern, frustration, and something that looked almost like fear. "David," Thomas began, pulling up a chair that materialized from the floor at his touch, "we have a problem. A big problem." "I still don't understand what I did wrong," David said, spreading his hands helplessly. It was supposed to be a simple physics demonstration about mechanical advantage and human strength. Thomas rubbed his temples like he had a massive headache. That's exactly the problem. David, do you have any idea how strong you are compared to other species in the galaxy? David blinked. Strong? I'm not particularly strong. I mean, I work out occasionally, but I'm just an average guy. There are plenty of humans who could lift much more than I can. The look on Thomas's face grew more troubled. David, that beam you lifted weighs exactly 203 pounds. We had it weighed after your demonstration. Okay, David said slowly. That's heavy, but not impossibly so. I've helped friends move furniture that weighed more than that. Thomas pulled out his own datapad and turned it toward David. The screen showed a series of charts and graphs that meant nothing to him, but Thomas began explaining each one. The strongest Chitauri on record, Thomas said, pointing to a bar graph, can lift a maximum of 32 pounds under ideal conditions. That's with mechanical assistance and full exoskeleton support. David stared at the numbers, trying to process what he was hearing. 32 pounds? That's like lifting a toddler. The Lumians, Thomas continued, cannot apply physical force at all. They manipulate matter through focused energy fields, but they literally cannot grab something and lift it the way you did. Their entire physiology is based on energy manipulation, not physical strength. He scrolled to another chart. The crystalline beings use harmonic resonance to move objects. They can shatter things or cause them to vibrate, but direct lifting? Maximum recorded weight, 18 pounds. David looked at the charts, then back at Thomas. But that doesn't make sense. How do they build things? How do they construct their cities and spaceships? With technology, Thomas said simply, incredible, advanced technology that we're only beginning to understand. They use force fields, gravity manipulation, molecular assemblers, things we can barely imagine. What they don't use is brute physical strength. The implications were starting to dawn on David, and he felt a strange mix of pride and horror. Are you telling me that humans are unusually strong? Dr. Hayes chose that moment to re-enter the medical bay, carrying a new set of datapads. Professor Miller, we've completed our analysis. Based on our findings, an average human possesses approximately 6 to 7 times the physical strength of the strongest known alien species. She sat down across from David, her expression serious. When you lifted that beam, every being in that room thought they were witnessing either a miracle or a demonstration of war-level technology. Some of them are still convinced you were using some kind of hidden mechanical enhancement. Thomas leaned forward. David, in the eyes of every other species in the galaxy, what you just did was the equivalent of a human casually juggling automobiles. They literally cannot comprehend how a biological being could possess that level of physical power. David sat in stunned silence, trying to wrap his mind around what he was hearing. Finally, he managed to speak. So when I was just trying to teach basic physics. You accidentally revealed that humans are the physical powerhouses of the galaxy, Dr. Hayes finished for him. And David, that changes everything. The news traveled faster than David could have imagined possible. Within 72 hours of his disastrous lecture, every major communication network in the galaxy was buzzing with reports of a human strength incident at Kepler Station. David learned this when Dr. Hayes showed him recordings of news broadcasts from dozens of different worlds, each one featuring grainy footage of him lifting the steel beam. What disturbed David most was how the footage had been analyzed frame by frame, with alien experts providing commentary that made him sound like some kind of supernatural being. One Lumian scientist on the Andromeda News Network spent 10 minutes explaining why what David had done should have been physically impossible for any organic creature. They are calling it the Miller phenomenon, Dr. Hayes explained as they watched yet another broadcast. Some of them think you were using hidden technology. Others believe humans have been hiding their true nature from the galactic community. David groaned and put his head in his hands. All I wanted to do was teach physics. Meanwhile, billions of light years away on Earth, Ambassador Patricia Clark was having the worst week of her diplomatic career. The emergency session of the Galactic Council had been going on for 3 days straight, and the questions were getting more intense by the hour. The council chamber was a massive sphere floating in space, with representatives from 4 to 7 different species arranged in concentric rings around a central speaking platform. Patricia had been standing on that platform for so long that her feet were starting to ache, fielding increasingly worried questions about human capabilities. "Ambassador Clark," said the lead Chitauri representative, its mechanical voice echoing through the translation systems, "we require clarification on human construction methods. Are you confirming that your species built structures like the pyramids and skyscrapers using primarily biological strength?" Patricia looked around at the faces, sensors, and optical organs all focused on her. These beings had been allies and trading partners for over a decade, but now she could see suspicion and fear in their expressions. "Yes," she said carefully. "Among other tools and techniques, humans have always used physical labor in construction. It's how we've built our civilization for thousands of years." The reaction was immediate. Representatives began talking among themselves in rapid bursts of clicks, chimes, and harmonics that the translation system couldn't keep up with. The Lumian delegation was pulsing with agitated colors, while the crystalline beings were resonating at frequencies that made Patricia's teeth ache. "You must understand our concern," said a representative from the Veil Nebula Collective, a species that looked like living shadows. "If humans possess this level of physical power, it raises questions about your military capabilities, your industrial potential, and frankly, your intentions in joining the galactic community." Back on Kepler Station, David was discovering that his life had become very different. His simple physics lectures were now the most popular attraction on the entire research facility. The lecture hall had been expanded twice to accommodate the crowds, and beings were traveling from other star systems just to witness what they called human strength demonstrations. David tried to explain that he was just a physics professor, not some kind of strongman performer, but nobody seemed to care about the distinction. Students would gasp and applaud when he moved equipment that he considered perfectly normal teaching materials. When he casually lifted a desk to demonstrate leverage, 3 Lumian students fainted. "Professor Miller," said a Chitauri graduate student after one particularly crowded lecture, "could you explain how humans developed such incredible physical capabilities? Did your species undergo genetic enhancement at some point in your evolution?" David looked at the eager faces surrounding him. "We didn't develop anything special," he tried to explain. "Humans evolved on a high-gravity world with dangerous predators and harsh conditions. We had to be strong to survive. Every human can do what I'm doing. Back on Earth, construction workers, athletes, even regular people moving houses do this kind of thing every day." The stunned silence that followed told David he had once again said something that shocked his alien audience. Dr. James Anderson, who had been hastily appointed as Director of Human-Alien Relations, was trying to manage the fallout from his office on Earth. His daily reports to the government were getting longer and more complicated as the implications of David's demonstration continued to ripple through galactic society. "The situation is unprecedented," he dictated to his assistant. "What we considered mundane physical capabilities have fundamentally altered humanity's status in galactic society. We are no longer viewed as a clever newcomers with interesting theoretical perspectives. We are now seen as a species capable of reshaping worlds with our bare hands." He paused, looking out his window at construction workers building a new office complex across the street. They were lifting steel beams, moving concrete blocks, and operating heavy machinery with casual efficiency. Things he had never given a second thought to now seemed almost miraculous when viewed through alien eyes. Every human construction project, every athletic event, every instance of someone helping a friend move furniture is now being seen as a display of superhuman strength, he continued. "We need to prepare for the possibility that our entire relationship with the galactic community is about to change." David, meanwhile, continued his lectures at Kepler Station, still somewhat bewildered by all the attention. He had come here to share knowledge about physics and had accidentally revealed that humans were the physical powerhouses of the galaxy. Students hung on his every word, not because of his teaching about momentum and energy, but because they were watching someone who could casually do things they considered impossible. After each lecture, David would return to his quarters and try to process what his life had become. He would look at his hands, the same hands that had graded papers and written equations for 20 years, and try to understand that these were the hands that had changed humanity's place in the universe. One physics demonstration at a time, David Miller was unknowingly cementing humanity's reputation as the galaxy's most unexpectedly powerful species, all while he just tried to teach basic science to curious students from across the stars.